So yeah, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining this evening. I always tend to overdo it with my slides, so I don't want us to be, getting glossy-eyed with too much screen time. So I'm going to launch right into it. Let me go ahead and do screen share. Let me do share sound. Quebec, Houston, Texas, right on. This is my very first time using Canva, and I got really carried away with all the visuals. So my little disclaimer is that I hope I don't make you too dizzy, but I was really excited to incorporate more movement. And as we, become familiar with all these interesting new tools, being able to share stories with each other in these exciting new ways. And I'm in my office right now, which is pretty junky behind me, which is why I put my mountain backdrop, which is where the farm is located. But I work at an art school. It's the Institute of American Indian Arts. And so it's a contemporary art school. And it's been really amazing to be able to incorporate science with culture and with artistic expression. So I hope you enjoy my presentation this evening, which is called Queens as Seeds. So we're going to go on a little journey here. Won't be a time warp, but we will do a little bit of back and forth looking at the history of bees, at least as what we have here in the States and how they got here and where they came from. And then also how that relates to us as humans and how it relates to our own stories as well. So hopefully you can see this up here. I've got this like little control thingy that might be, hopefully it's not too much in the way, but creating and sharing our stories together as bees and as beekeepers. So this is my story, which I'll start off with.
I've traveled many a bumpy road in the darkest of nights, serving as a chauffeur to beings of sweet starlight. I migrate with them, like a shepherd, roaming with my flock of winged midwives, as a fellow follower of the bloom, a self-proclaimed nectar nomad. I was introduced to this artistic science of beekeeping 2 decades ago, as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer collaborating with peasant farmers in South America. The bees captivated my curious mind, and working in an outdoor office made of fresh air, flowers, and freedom enticed my soul. My nomadic journey as an apiculturist has taken me far from where I could ever have imagined, having come from a humble home in Pueblo Indian country in New Mexico. My heritage is a mosaic of cellular memories influenced by my Native American ancestors, who instilled in me a profound reverence for place and purpose, and to pursue acts of community service. So I chose to become a bee farmer, as I wanted to continue to learn from Mother Nature and Father Time. As a farmer, I share beekeepers' voices of concern and need for adaptation and innovation to fulfill our dedication for local to global food production. Sharing their challenges, I became encouraged to return to academia to help quantify their observations and advocate for pollinator conservation. Now, as a researcher, my quest to better understand the relationship between cultures, food systems, and stewardship is at the forefront of my thoughts. Honeybees are like some of us and our ancestors, immigrants to this country. They have adapted and become the backbone of agriculture. There are distinct ecotypes or subspecies of honeybees like races in humans, and these ecotypes carry genetic histories like seeds which contain their very existence and memories of creation. For within each one, they have the power to nurture and adapt, and the magnificence to create life, food, and medicine for the world. One of the things I most enjoy about beekeeping is that it bridges cultures and goes beyond borders. It connects us to our origins as fellow beings of light, as a part of this land, not separate from it. This magnificence is alluring and inspires me to find and connect with bees and their keepers around the globe. I invite you all to accompany me on my nectar nomad storytelling journey as I chase the bloom, encounter cultures, and follow the liquid starlight known as honey from flora to flavor to feast.
So yeah, that's my story in a nutshell. And I like to share, I took a little digital storytelling class right after we went into lockdown. And it was at a point in time where I was, kind of had the rug pulled out from underneath me, just like everybody else, and was trying to figure out not so much how to reinvent myself, but what was important in my life and what did I want to really convey with not only my actions, but also with my interests, my passions, my commitment to sustainability and to helping provide good food for good people. And so that's where that came from. And I like to play it till the end because it gives credit to my mom who played the flute. She's the musician. She's the soundtrack for my little video. And that's what this whole presentation is about, is really about setting the stage and sharing a script to then really let us see the drama unfold, right? Whether it's of our own lives or of the organisms, these beloved creatures, these bees that we love, and all that they come into contact with. And so the environment, or our environment, collectively is our stage, and our genetics, both individually and then also collectively as a biodiverse group of beings, becomes the script. And it shows how all this can unfold, this drama can unfold in this very sometimes seemingly chaotic, sometimes seemingly toxic, sometimes seemingly even beatific performances, right? And it comes down to behavior. We start to see how we behave, not only with each other, but with our surroundings, and how we adapt to it, how we alter our attitude, our behavior, how we modify and acclimate or evolve to a new condition, and how we change and adjust. So there's a lot of research out there. And this is just, I know this looks really hectic, so I don't expect you to really focus in on it, especially with bees flying on the screen. But there's a lot of research out there that talks about not only genetics, but how that it affects behavior, or how behaviors are sort of exposed by the environment. Let's see if it'll go. Next screen. Why isn't it going? Oh, there we go. And so the environment times the genotype, or times the genetics, right, cross, which is the species, will then give rise to what we call a phenotypic expression, or these ecotypes or strains, right? How speciation even really occurs, but how you even get varying differences among different organisms. So for instance, with humans, right, we all are human beings, but we also have various strains or races of human beings. And their experiences really do create memories, and these memories become stories. And these stories, actually, did I skip one? No, we're good. And these stories actually become seeds. They become ingrained and encoded, and they become part of the script. And these seeds then are able to be shared, and are able to move, and are able to be transformed depending on what else they're experienced the next go round. And so when we look across the globe and we see all the different climatic situations going on, the various topographies, the different elevations, whether it's coast, whether it's inland, we see all of these different environmental effects playing on these organisms, playing on us, and playing on bees as well. And it does give rise over time to evolutionary changes. And these evolutionary changes then get encoded back into the seeds. All these different traits now, these different sort of dramas that unfold, these behaviors, these memories become encoded and scripted and then saved as traits. And they're passed along through these seeds. And ultimately, these seeds go where life takes them, whether that's a bee or a plant, or some other animal, mineral, vegetable, or human even. So I'm going to take us back in time a little bit and talk to you all about the history of bees as it relates to where we are now, especially those of us stateside, where honeybees are not necessarily considered endemic. And so this is a really cool paper that came out. This is actually talking about a few different kinds of bees, Apis mellifera, or the honeybees, Apis cerana, Apis dorsata, Florea, a few other ones, but talking about when they sort of made their appearance on the planet. And it's a lot to break down. I'm not going to dwell on it, but I will share this presentation with you all afterwards in case you want to check out these links and look into it yourself. But I wanted to share it just as reference to show, these different sort of eras that occurred and how bees were moved and then their reintroduction to North America. So there's also another paper. This is actually one of my favorites to really pull up. And again, the links will be here, so you'll have access to them. That talks about migration theories, not only the origin, but also now the migration. So if you look at that middle one, where you can see Africa really big with an A on it, that these different letters correspond to different parts of quote unquote the old world where honeybees that we know today are endemic to. And so the photo on the right at the top actually shows the honeybee there, and they're, there's still actually not a full consensus as to where honeybees originated from, but the thoughts are that it's either Middle East or Africa or possibly even Asia, but then they went in all these different directions. And so just like people, as like I shared with my story, they migrated, they moved, they followed resources, right? And so whether or not they went one direction first or another way first, that's still, to be determined, so to speak. But it's interesting to think about, like, how did they get to where they are? And then also, how did that play out in all the different kinds of bees that we see? So there's over 30 recognized subspecies or ecotypes of Apis mellifera. They're considered to be endemic to the Eastern Hemisphere. And the formal trinomial applies, meaning that they're all Apis mellifera. They can all intermate with each other, but depending on where they became most acclimated, they become really attuned to that location. And so the third name indicates a connection to a place. So we have Apis mellifera intermesa, Apis mellifera iberica, Apis mellifera mellifera, Apis mellifera ligustica, and I'll talk about those a little bit more here. So what does that mean for us stateside, right? Now hopping over to the quote unquote new world, which was already existing, or as some of us like to refer to it as Turtle Island. And not very many people are familiar with this, but we actually did have our own native honeybee here in the Americas called Apis mellifera nearctica. And so there's fossil evidence that was found in Nevada, actually, that dates about 14 million years old, showing that there was a honeybee here on our continent. And so for me, I really like to consider, and I don't want to take us back to that slide because I'm afraid I'll glitch the whole thing, but the very first map I showed you where it talked about the different kinds of bees and when they were the different eras where they got moved into, I don't know if anybody noticed, but where it showed North America, it shows reintroduction of Apis mellifera. And so I definitely follow that train of thought that this ancestor bee, what we have now is actually the cousins to this ancestor bee. And so going forward, right, we don't have that Apis mellifera nearctica here anymore, but we do have honeybees here. And so how did they get here? And so when settlers came over and as people, were being persecuted and were looking for safer places to live and to raise their families, and they migrated over to this large continent, they brought different things with them. They didn't know what was going to be here. So they brought seeds, they brought various livestock, they brought different foods with them, and they brought different customs with them as well. But what they also brought were honeybees. And so it's a very long, arduous journey, obviously, and not everybody made it. So the bees that were brought were originally brought from England area and from the western part of Europe, because those were the closest to the coast, right, to get out. And then in the 20s, they shut the border due to the Isle of Wight disease, which is basically tracheal mites. But as steamships began to become invented and being used more often, then they were able to bring in more bees from other places. And actually, I mixed that up. They didn't shut the borders till the 20s. So right before the 20s, when steamboats were starting to be used, that's when they were able to bring in bees from even farther away. But there was a kind of lapse in there. They didn't bring bees from everywhere because bees were already starting to proliferate here on the continent. So if they were doing well in adapting, right, creating new stories, creating new memories that they're able to pass on, then there wasn't really a need to bring in more. But then with steamships, they thought, well, let's bring in some more because it's a little bit easier now. And then in the 20s, they shut the borders due to that disease. And that law is actually still on the books. So by law, nobody can bring in live bees from other countries. Now, they are able to bring in semen, and it has to go through rigorous testing and all sorts of screenings to make sure it doesn't have viruses. And then they're able to, using instrumental insemination, back cross and get to about 97% of the original stock line. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about why that is happening. But this here is showing just a list of importations as they've been recorded of being brought in, okay? So Mellifera mellifera, Apis mellifera mellifera brought in from Europe, Ligustica was brought in from Europe. Those are what we call Italian bees. Lamarcki, Carnica, Cypria, the list goes down. I included Russian crosses on the bottom, but Russian crosses aren't technically their own subspecies. They are a cross, they're a mix, but they were also brought in. And then in the early 2000s, like I said, there was kind of a larger gap now too, but in the early 2000s, through Washington State University, they brought in some semen and were able to start doing back crosses. So they brought in originally some Italian strains, they brought in some Carnica strains, and then more recently Caucasica and Apis mellifera pulmonella, which is from Kazakhstan. And that's because Washington State grows a lot of apples. Apis mellifera pulmonella is from the mountain and apple growing region in Kazakhstan. So the bees are really in tune with that cycle because that's their main forage up there. And so now we're going to switch gears. Okay, I took you back in time, but like these little seeds, we're being thrown across the ocean, right? We're resettling over here on this continent, and now we're situated and we proliferated and we're getting to expand and to also be moved even more than ever before. And interestingly, we don't necessarily tend to think of, well, what does that mean then about the bees that we have here? If these bees historically have come from areas where they had a lot of time to acclimate to a particular region, so much so that they became their own subspecies, right? They became their own ecotype. Then what does that mean for American bees? And so there's a really cool paper that came out a number of years ago through COLOS, which is a volunteer scientific organization that anybody can join, actually, costs like $30 a year. And they're a consortium of scientists from around the world and apiculturists, so those who are really interested in bees, working together to figure out why bees are dying. So COLOS actually stands for colony losses. And they put out a paper a number of years ago that was published in the International Bee Research Association publication called Honeybee Genotypes in the Environment. And what they found was that, in a nutshell, that a bee that performs well in one region may not perform well in an area with different conditions or in another area with similar conditions. Basically, they were trying to show that, when we move bees, even this particular study took place in Europe. When we move bees to different places, these ecotypes now don't necessarily perform as well in a new area as the ones that have really acclimated in that particular area. And so coming stateside, what does that mean, right? So local bees fare better than non-local ones. And the research indicates that a more sustainable beekeeping is possible by breeding bees from local populations. Now, not all of us have access to local bees, right? But there's a growing movement of folks who are really looking to try and help reestablish or nurture local ecotypes or local strains that can fare better. And it's not to say that we can't move bees or that we shouldn't move bees. Honeybees have moved on their own and they're very adaptive, but they need time to do that. And when we move them cross country, especially with larger pollination events and all these other additional environmental stresses that happen, they may not necessarily be able to adapt as quickly. So what about us beekeepers? Are we able to adapt? Are we able to learn from these cousins that are now here, but from where they originated from, and what that means for us here as stewards trying to keep our bees healthy and in some cases make a living off of them, or in other cases provide pollination services for our community for food security and production. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about my adaptation. I first got started in Paraguay as a Peace Corps volunteer. And I decided what I would do with this presentation was share with you all the different places I've been and just what I learned along the way, the lessons learned, and how it helped me to adapt and really sort of glean the benefits, create my own story, right? Capture those memories that can help me survive as a beekeeper into the future to help take care of these beloved creatures that fascinate me so much. So some of the lessons I learned in Paraguay were, especially as a brand new beekeeper, were how to catch wild swarms in the subtropics, how to make equipment with low tech. We made all our own boxes with just a machete. We didn't have power tools. We even made our own smokers out of coffee cans and our own veils. Observing seasonal fluctuations. I didn't realize how much the environment played on the behavior of the bees because I was brand new to it. So everything just really blew me away. And observing those seasonal fluctuations in terms of how to handle these aggressive strains. There's a lot of AHB in this particular area. And so I knew no different. I had never worked bees anywhere else. So I just thought all bees were like that, right? And how to start with low-tech queen raising, which was really sort of the basis for becoming fascinated with keeping bees. I spent a little bit of time after I finished my service traveling, and I ended up working in Mexico just for about 6 months. And I didn't actually work as a beekeeper. I actually worked at a bamboo furniture making company, believe it or not, as a quality control manager, translating for Mayan artisans. And but there was a beekeeper who had hives on the back of the property. And so of course, as soon as I found that out, I was like, I want to go. And so lessons learned there were don't over insulate, because they use these sort of plastic bags that they had cut up to put on the tops of the hives. And it was causing a lot of increased humidity, which I think made those bees much more aggressive. But they knew to isolate them, right? They had them at the way back of the property, and how to communicate for safety when dealing with really aggressive strains. After that experience, I actually got to go to Hawaii, where I stayed and worked for 5 years, which is what really introduced me into the larger industry and practice of rearing queens as a profession. And so I worked at Hawaiian Queen first, and I credit Michelle Crones with teaching me how to graft. And then I went and worked at Kona Queen for 4 years, where I got a lot of practice grafting. I grafted every day, 6 days a week, 1,500 queen cells a day. So I just got a lot of practice. But I got to see a whole system, and it just blew me away, especially starting, with my Peace Corps scenario, which was very rustic, to all of a sudden now like commercial queen rearing and factory farming USA. And it just blew me away at how amazing and choreographed and coordinated their process was. But I learned how to work with diverse crosses of bees, how to establish double queen cell raisers with cloak boards. I got to work with an international crew with various team roles, and I got to kind of switch between team roles. I learned about grafting, incubating, catching, banking, and shipping queens, how to handle them. Prior to that, I had used gloves, and when I started working there, they said, nobody's allowed to wear gloves. And so I had to figure that out. But I remember being really nervous at first, and then coming to really appreciate it, because I felt I felt an intimacy develop between me and the bees because I was more in tune with my own actions, but how they were affecting them. And then queen ring as an operation. Um, after leaving there, because I got a little bit we call sort of island fever, right? I wanted to travel a little bit more. I actually went back to Paraguay and was a trainer for new volunteers doing beekeeping. And so I was able to apply all my skills that I had learned in Hawaii there, which I realized at the time, I was like, gosh, if I knew all this when I had been a volunteer, how much more effective I could have been. But live and learn, I was able to go and help impart some of that with new volunteers there. And some of the lessons that I learned once I got back, because then I decided, well, I'm ready to go, kind of do bees elsewhere. I ended up getting a job in Florida and got to work for Gary Oreskovich of Honeyland Farms, and he's a migratory beekeeper. So I didn't actually go work with him in Wisconsin, but I did get to see what his Florida operation was like. And I also got to see somebody who was, in all honesty, very grumpy, but extremely meticulous. I consider him my number one mentor. He was a very, very graceful beekeeper, but also very serious beekeeper. And he did everything from comb honey production to orange blossom honey production to he milled and saw all his own wood for his equipment. He sold nukes, he sold packages, he sold queens. He did a little bit of everything, and he moved all his own bees. He migrated them between Wisconsin and Florida. So I got to see a diversified production operation. I got to see how to use single queen right cell builders with double excluders, which is the system I still use to this day. A lot of my breeding system or rearing system is modeled off of what I learned working for Gary, and also working with an international crew, but much smaller. In Hawaii, we had, I think we had 19 to 20 people on the crew, and working at Gary's, we had 4 plus him and another and his business partner. So there were 6 of us working. And then how to do packages. I never had seen packages made or even starter nukes made. It's that time of the day. I'd only seen mating nukes. And so now I got to learn, you can actually make splits and offer them to people. So it just really kind of blew me away how much you could do with a really nice tight ship of an operation. And while there, I met my farm partner, Mark Spitzig, who's from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And I was actually supposed to go to New Zealand to go work, but I ended up going with him to Michigan for the summer. And lessons learned, I ended up staying there a full year. I even went through a whole 9 months of winter up in Michigan, especially in the UP. But I really learned how to do small scale selection and closed population beginnings. We started with he had 50 hives, and we were able to multiply them into 100. And we started with what he had in terms of the genetics. And the story that he likes to share is that, he had, he started with 2 books, 2 packages, and a couple friends. And as time went on, the friends kind of found other things to do, but he was the only one who stuck with it. And he said about 3 years in, he went from about 2 hives to 5 to 17 units of he didn't know what. He said swarms were hanging from the trees, and he realized, I got to go work for a professional. So he went to work for Gary, which is, he had actually purchased some of his original bees from Gary, and decided he wanted to learn more about how to actually keep bees alive, but also to be able to make a honey business out of it. And so when I teamed up with him, he had been selling honey already for about 5 years to the Marquette local food co-op. But then with the queen rearing skills that I had, we were able to multiply it, and we started with what he had. And so he had actually, it was really funny because I had started, of course, with this rustic scenario where we jimmy rigged and made everything from scratch. And he had started with, I've got this catalog and it says I need this, this, and that. And he would get everything that it said. And I would be like, we could just use toothpicks, or we could just make that. And so it was a real interesting sort of blend as to how we began to work in a partnership. But to kind of close out this segment of the journey, he realized that, all the medications that were being offered, he said he started looking at the fine print, and he was like, he got more he was more frightened by all the fine print of these different antibiotics than he was of the disease itself. And so he took a class with Dr. Marla Spivak in Minnesota. This is in 2000, and it was called Beekeeping in Northern Climates. And at that time, she said anecdotally that in their area, that what they noticed was that if you did not treat your bees for mites, that within 18 months they would crash. And so he thought, well, I'm going to see if I can get any to live past 18 months. And so that's what we started with, were these hives that had overwintered queens that were at least 2 winters old, and then started using those as breeders. And so a lot of that stock was Carniolan, because it's sincere winter up there, but he also had some Italian crosses as well. So it was a little mix of strains. And we started to multiply the resources. Like I mentioned, we took the 50 hives and multiplied them into 100. And I learned, actually, since there's a sincere winter up there, how to employ some really good overwintering techniques. And it's not cold that'll kill your bees. It's lack of ventilation and moisture. I should have put that on there. But flash forward, I somehow convinced him to bring his bees to New Mexico. And this is my home area, but I had never kept bees here before. I worked 8 years for other people, learning, initially in the tropics, and then in the cold north, but I had never kept bees in my own home state. So he and I actually learned how to keep bees together in New Mexico. We learned about high elevation beekeeping. He was actually very afraid that all the bees would turn aggressive. He thought, oh, it's hot desert. Don't you have Africanized bees down there? And I said, well, there are some in the southern counties, but we have mountains. And he was really surprised that we actually had distinct seasons. And what he was even more surprised was that at high elevation, the growing season was very similar to northern Michigan, just due to the high elevation. So we turned then his closed population to establish a more selective breeding paradigm, meaning that we started to integrate some more additional stock lines. And one of the reasons for that was that we actually started to see a little bit of inbreeding start to present itself. And we thought, oh, okay, maybe we need to get some more genetics in here. And so we started to do some research and really tried to start integrating in strains from other producers who we really admired their philosophy and their practices. We did a few projects working with other beekeepers, and then learning how to manage our resources, especially as we were building this out of pocket. We're both first generation beekeepers, meaning we didn't inherit any bees or any equipment. We had to really, tooth and nail it and build it all from just our blood, sweat, and tears. And we also learned how to use the topography for our breeding testing grounds and how to also maximize our seasons. So, being that we're at elevation, we're able to utilize the landscape not only for isolated breeding grounds, but then also to drop down to lower elevations to capture additional nectar flows. So in a good year, which they're very rare, we can get 3 springs. We can get, a desert lowland spring, and then we can get one in the canyon, and then we can get a mountain alpine one. And I'll talk a little bit more about my New Mexico up in a minute. We did, California started creeping its way in, where we started doing some projects out there. And so I got to learn about early season production and working now in collaboration, and then now sharing resources between operations, and trans-regional extension, trying to use multiple locations to not necessarily maximize the season, but to actually try to help the breeding paradigm have more testing potential, to see our bees in action and to be able to select from where they're working at, but then also to find nutritious food at different times of the year, especially where our home breeding grounds are, which you can tell from my background. We get some good snow, it's the Rocky Mountains. And so our spring bloom is still, another month and a half off. And so by being able to go to the West Coast, we're able to start that whole production process sooner. And then we started sharing breeding stock. I then, after being in the field for 15 years, decided to go back to school. I had a lot of observations. I really wanted to understand, the biology behind it all better. I also was really curious about trying to help translate for farmers. I found that when, researchers and farmers would talk and it would be two different languages. And I also didn't really like how farmers' experiences were dismissed, because it wasn't peer reviewed or published, then it's considered irrelevant. And I thought, well, that's not appropriate. I mean, some of these beekeepers have been beekeeping for generations or for decades. What they know is very valid and can be very helpful. And so I felt a real calling to go back to school to help learn that scientific lingo, to help be a translator and to help build a bridge between the two. So I got to learn a lot about breeding research, scientific inquiry. I learned a little bit about instrumental insemination as a tool for sort of speeding up time with trying to make selection. The integration of imported strains and even cryopreservation, and how that all the details and nuances and the fragility of that system, but just what magnificence it can really bring to the table in terms of sharing genetic material. And then also institutional processes, how universities work and how they work with collaborators and with funders and applying for grants and such. I actually took my bees just one winter and put them in cold storage in Idaho. So I listed it here because I tried it out, but I've not had my bees there for a full season. But I definitely learned about the migratory challenges that those beekeepers do face, and even that I experienced myself. I learned a little bit about how to overwinter in cold storage, which we use now in our own operation in our own small scale way, and about sharing space in those places. But now I'm really going to talk to you, and I know we're gonna hit time here soon. So we're at the meat of it. That was the buildup. But really talking to you about the trans-regional survivor stock and longevity-based breeding program that we do at Zia Queen Bees. And I used to call my bees survivor stock initially, and then I came to find that a lot of people have their own definition. There's not really a solid format that people follow for it. And I decided to then, rephrase it and calling it a longevity base. So we select for longevity, which I mentioned, they have to make it through that 18-month threshold. And longevity is actually a heritable trait. So if you can find those bees that can endure, then the hope is that they're passing those stories and those memories on to the next generation. So Zia Queen Bees, and this is our home breeding grounds. And I have to actually be honest, because we moved the farm. This is through Chesapeake's, which means trout. We moved the farm like 10 miles down the road around the bend to another really beautiful peak, but I don't have a picture of it. It's called Jicarita, but this is all the Sangre de Cristo mountain range up in here. And we're at about 8,000 foot elevation. And then, as I mentioned, we drop down and can capture additional flows. These are some pictures from up in the mountains where we get it's a shorter season, but it's a really lush summer season, whereas down in the valley, it'll get hot and dry. And this is just to show, if you look at New Mexico right here, I hope you can see my little turquoise bullet. I guess you call this, what do we call that? I forgot now, I'm losing my language, but New Mexico's right here next to Texas and in between Arizona and Texas. But you can see we get a real diversity of temperatures. We get warm, but we also get hot and dry, and we also get really cold. And with increasing drought, especially here in the American West, finding bees and finding forage and adapting our practices is essential if we want to be able to survive out here. And it really does come down to finding what the bees need so that they're healthy, so that they have good nutrition, because there's always going to be mites, there's always going to be viruses. But if your nutrition can stay up, and if you can breed or find those bees to integrate into your apiaries that have been bred to handle these variations and to overcome them in a positive way, then we have a fighting chance. So there are continuous needs and challenges that we find, whether you're migrational or commercial professional, whether you're a sedentary hobbyist or a novice. The importance of finding resilient and adaptable stock is extremely important. It's like finding a needle in the haystack, to be honest. And then how to sustainably propagate it. And how does that integrate and affect, the agroecosystem in different landscapes? And how do we find, or how can we nurture nutrition and food as medicine to not only keep our bees healthy, but to keep us as their stewards and our communities healthy, right? And these various environmental impressions, which depending on where you're at, can range from everything from, shifting weather to maybe bad air quality to, toxic water or, pesticide issues, who knows? I mean, I'm in New Mexico. It's a beautiful place, but we have 2 national labs here. I live about 50 miles as the bees fly from Los Alamos labs. So we've got a lot of nuclear residues out in this place. So it's not a perfect place, but really no place is, right? And so you have to really persevere through those different challenges, just like your bees would. So some people like to say nature versus nurture. I like to say nature nurtures and tortures, but they become these selective pressures because whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And that definitely is what works for bees, or what will impact them as well. If it's too much, obviously they won't make it, right? But there is a fine line between what can be beneficial in terms of them creating memories that can be passed on, and then what is maybe too much that then just wipes them out. And then integrated systems with pest management, supplements and treatments, land stewardship, consilience, applied research, and my favorite, which is biomimicry. So a lot of our operation is based on following Mother Nature's lead, what I like to call Father Time tested, Mother Nature approved, because we're going through time. We're using time to help us select. These are just some shots from our area. The top one is spring bloom, which March notoriously gets warm. So the plants are all going to wake up, and you got fruit trees. We got a lot of stone fruit in the northern Rio Grande Valley. But then as that cold snow starts to melt, all that cold air comes rushing down the canyon. I call it the Rocky Mountain Whistle. And then April gets cold again. So it's a pretty fragile time of the year. And then we have some pretty lush summers, which you can see here on the right. And then we also have these drier locations. This is actually down on the Rio Chama. The yellow and orange hives are called Bert and Ernie, and they are a part of the Christ in the Desert Monastery apiaries, which I help them maintain. And then we also have we can get a pretty brisk fall. I've seen snow as early as August 16th in our area. Of course, it melts right away. And I've seen it as late as June 10th. So there's usually snow on these peaks in the background for most of the year. And here's some winter shots. So believe it or not, this is northern New Mexico in the winter if we have good snowpack. So talking now about breeding, I think very pictorially. So, thinking as a hexagon, right? What are these various things that go into breeding queens? So you've got your breeders, your cell builders, your grafting, and actually nukes should be on here on the bottom, mating nukes. I think I forgot to put that in, I apologize. Then how you're gonna care for your cells, and then your catching and harvesting. And they all revolve around quality genetics, conscientious propagation, and mindful management. Because in the end, this is what we want. We want to be able to rear healthy queens and healthy drones that they can mate with. And so here's a little bit of our process. We do the Doolittle grafting method. We graft day 3 and 4. They get put into our queen right cell builders. Sometimes when we need a lot of cells, we'll use a queen-less cell builder, which is kind of like a walk-away split, but you just really stuff it full of bees and resources, a lot of pollen, because they need the pollen to make royal jelly. And then we'll leave them be for about 10 days in there after the graft. That means they're now day 13. The queens are going to pop on day 15. So on day 13 is when we start making nukes, and then we take these queen cells out. We don't like to handle them prior to that because the wings are the last to form. And if they get really jostled, then what good is a queen that can't fly if her wings are rubbed off? So we carry them out in a little cooler, and also put them on a little swim ring in the car, and whoever's holding them has to lift them over every bump, which, let me tell you, New Mexico has terrible roads, so you get strong arms doing that. And then they each get placed in a mating nuke. And then about a month later, we go back, and now we can see that there's eggs, larvae, and capped brood, which can indicate that mating was successful, because we can see worker brood that's capped. Then they get caught, meaning harvested. And then if we bank them, it's usually just for a couple days, although I've banked up to a couple weeks if need be, but I try and get queens out right away for folks. So here's some shots. This is our, again, I mentioned modeled after what we learned working for Gary. And so we use a lot of standard equipment. We switched from deeps to what we call 3/4. And so these are queen castles. So each one of these has 3 mating nukes inside. And so this is how we started. And then this is what we're kind of switching over to, because let me tell you, my back ain't what it used to be. So I'm switching over to smaller mating nuke sizes, and even some of the polyester styro ones, just because they're lighter and they provide really good insulation. And actually, I'll go back real quick. This is actually taken in January so I mentioned we do a little bit of our own kind of mini cold storage. And so we put these nukes in October. Actually, we waited till November. We put them into the garage, which is unheated. And then we pulled them out in January. So this was actually their first day out. They're pooping everywhere, doing cleansing flights. And then they got put on the truck and taken to California, and they're back into production again. So, and we have a whole, fresh batch of overwintered queens that are ready to use for making splits. So this is third year doing this. I'm going to try and do a little write-up paper on this, because the first year was a bust, but the last 2 years we've been getting better at it. So a lot of lessons learned on trying to do that. And this is one of our main collaborators now in California. So that's sort of our main circuit, is we just go out there starting in January to kind of let the bees build up on eucalyptus and rosemary. We actually have our hives placed with Aidan Wing of Wings of Nature Bees, and he is located on the Bay Peninsula Preserve, which is in the Santa Cruz coastal mountains. So it's a nature preserve, so it's not big ag. So it's really beautiful forage out there. And we're very grateful that he shares space with us. And we started off as friends and mentors to him, and now he's running his own thing. And so he's really come a long way. Very proud to know him and work with him. And that's him right there with his thumbs up with queens. And it does indeed take a community to raise bees. Whether working with a partner, whether working with a club, or whether working with additional collaborators. I'm going to kind of breeze through these next ones, because I just want to share with you a few projects that we've done over the years, because it really does come down to community. But I kind of already explained to you what survivor stock is and why selecting for longevity is important, because it is a heritable trait. It's also an umbrella trait. So over time, you can see if they're pest disease resistant, hygienic, can overwinter well, can produce well, if they remain gentle or not. And so we use our 3 locational case studies for that selection, between Michigan, where we first partnered up, New Mexico, where we're based, and then also our collaborations in California. And beyond. I mean, we've got collaborators who are in Colorado, Pennsylvania. I mean, I didn't even list everybody, but these are a few of the folks that because we still integrate in some stock, but we're really mindful about what stock we bring in. And also we reintegrate some of our old stock too. When we share queens with people, if those queens live at least through 2 winters and they're nearby, I ask to graft daughters off of them to bring it back into the system, so we don't lose these really good traits. And so it really comes down to the conservation of species or subspecies, or in this case, our varying ecotypes and crosses, but also conserving the habitat, finding those places in which we can keep our bees healthy, and also conservation of us as their stewards. Like how can we adapt? So couple projects we did was Southwest Survivor Queen Bee Project. Got my first Western SARE grant in 2007, which was just working with a few beekeepers in New Mexico. And then number of years later, about 5 years later, I launched the Rocky Mountain Survivor Queen Bee Cooperative, which actually I'll show a few slides of this. We had beekeepers in northern New Mexico, predominantly because southern New Mexico does have aggressive bee strains, and that's just due to lower elevation. Those strains are able to really establish there, whereas up north we get a sincere winter and they don't last up here. But you can see all of these elevations are over a mile high. And then we also had 3 collaborators in Colorado too, who participated with us. So we had 9 beekeepers total. It was about almost 500 miles spread. And we came up with this little manual, which I'll share the link for you, but Ange has that beautiful manual out now. So I think you guys you're taken care of on that end. And now the newer project, flash forward another 5 years, and I recently launched the Adaptive Bee Breeders Alliance, which includes That They Keep Bees, and Sam, Comfort, and a lot of other really wonderful bee breeders. All of us are first generation beekeepers, meaning we've all started from scratch. And so we've had to learn the hard way. We've had to learn through perseverance. We've had to, learn the expensive way at times, but we've all become friends because we've got similar I want to say, interests and motivations and aspirations. And so it's really nice to work in community. And I'm very, very pleased to say, just literally 2 days ago, I got an email for saying that we got a grant. Our Western SARE grant that I submitted has been funded. So we'll be launching some larger collaborative research projects coming this fall. And these are the producers who will be participating. And we've also got 10 researchers from across the country who will be working with us as well. So in addition to all of this sort of story of adaptation, you know, having the benefits and the blessings to be able to learn from bees and beekeepers around the world. A lot of our adaptive bee breeders have kept bees in varying locations, both stateside and also internationally as well. And it really just shows us that, you know, adaptation is possible. We can learn from every place that we go. These memories that we make, not only as stewards, but that our bees make in these varying places, really do intertwine together so that we have this sort of symbiotic relationship and this story of reciprocity wherein we take care of each other. So as stewards of our lands, air, waters, and health, it is imperative for us to be proactive in researching and implementing sustainable practices. And I share these pictures because these are my kiddos, and my daughter, who's in the first one, is now 13 and she's an inch taller than me. So I still like to show their little kid pictures. And this is my son on the right, who's now 10. So he's also a lot bigger. But they tolerate my beekeeping. And yes, they are the seeds of the future, just like our bees. And so like seeds, so are the bees. They have the magnificence of creating food, medicine, and life for the world. And I feel it's such a humbling honor to be able to work with them and to nurture their ability to sustain themselves, but also they definitely sustain me. So here's a few of the different organizations that I participate in. I love collaborations, but I also love working in community. And so being able to work with different organizations and with the different people in these organizations, and of course, if they're beekeepers, learning from them and their bees is really just, I'll be a forever student of this scientific art, or this artistic science, as I like to call it. So bringing you back from this little story trip here. Thank you so much for listening to me. And the mystery is the allure. Don't ever forget that. Let me stop share. So there we go. Did I actually, oh my God, I'm like a minute over. That's not bad. Usually I go way over. But we have time for questions. I will put in the chat a couple links. I'll put a link for that Rocky Mountain Survivor Queen Bee Queen Rearing Manual, because it does show some step-by-steps. Talks a little bit about walkaway splits, talks a little bit about queen right cell builders and grafting, like your cell builder setup, where you should have your pollen frames and your graft frames, and if you want to do multiple grafts in the same cell builder. So I'll put that link in the chat for that manual if you're interested in seeing it. And it's free, it's downloadable, and it's because it was from a SARE project, so everybody's welcome to it.
Okay, so I'm going to read you the questions in the order that I have them here, Melanie. The first question is, what is considered a locally adapted bee, i.e. overwintered at least 3 times, question mark? So I guess maybe like what quantifies local adaptation?
That's a really good question. And I think I'm still figuring it out, to be honest. Because, you know, when we look at the history of bees, the millennia it took them to really become rooted, so much so that then they became their own subspecies, you know, and they have genetic markers that really indicate that. I mean, a few years is just really pales in comparison, but I think it's a starting point. And so for us as a starting point, it's, you know, let's see who can make it through, especially in regards to Varroa resistance, which that's the big thing we're all trying to like get a grasp on. I feel like, you know, trying to get them to live as long as possible. And when I walk a fine line between treating and non-treating. First of all, I just hate the word treatment. I'd rather think of it as therapies or supplements. I don't know why, that just sounds nicer to me than like saying I'm treating. But I used to be a real purist and was like, no, I'm not going to do anything. And then I started to see the benefits of essential oils, especially because they're rooted in plant medicines, and that's what bees are. That's what they know are plant medicines. And they're their ultimate own, medics and nurses. And so, I have my breeding stock that I don't, treat at all, but I do have, those other ones where their thresholds go up and down. And I also don't panic. When I see mite levels go up, I go, okay, I'm going to wait and check again. But if they get to the point where I really see the hive starting to succumb, then I just requeen. I just cut them out. Like, why crutch somebody along if they're also going to now pose a real sincere threat to, the other hives in the area, not just my own, but my neighbors' hives. So, but my first line of defense is really starting with mite resistant stock. And we had Dr. Seeley come out to visit one year. I got a small grant from the New Mexico Department of Agriculture and was able to bring him out to do a couple lectures and taught us how to beeline. And he had asked us why he thought our mite counts were so low. And we're going, well, maybe it's the elevation, or maybe it's the dryness, maybe it's, the forage. And he's like, I think it's your selection. And I thought, oh, well, I thought, that was our hope, but I didn't want to, assume it as such, especially as a beekeeper who isn't published in a bunch of, scientific journals, yet, so to speak. I was a little hesitant to make that claim, but I think when we're looking at trying to start with resistant stock, when we're looking at what's acclimated, trying to get them through at least a couple winters can really help, because every queen ideally should make it at least through one, right? It's how can they handle those fluctuations over time? So that's a really good question. I don't know if I have a real answer for you, but it's a starting point.
All right, awesome. Also, I just want to name that I didn't know that everybody in the Adaptive Bee Breeders Alliance is a first generation farmer / beekeeper, and that definitely gave me chills and made me a little weepy. So okay.
We lift each other up. That's what we do.
Yeah, it's really cool to see all those unique perspectives and like see them all come together cohesively. So thank you for that. Okay, so this question is about cell raisers. So someone is asking for clarity about cell raiser methods. And they're asking if you can explain what single queen right colonies with double excluders means.
Oh, okay. So for us, that means you have your brood chambers, usually 2, and you keep your queen down there so she's constantly laying. You put an excluder, then you put your supers, then you put another excluder, and then you actually put your cell builder box on top of that. And the idea is that the resources you're going to need for the cell builder box, you can pull from down below. When she gets plugged up, you need sealed brood because you're going to need nurse bees up there. We would also put older open brood up there. Older because then you don't have to worry about those larvae competing for royal jelly with your cells, but they're still needing nurse bees. So there's nurse bees coming up to take care of them. And any honey or pollen that gets, kind of plugged out down there, you can pull it up top and have it and put it in your alignment for your nursery box. And then as those empty out, you take the empties and put them back down below. So it becomes its own little system that perpetuates itself. And if they get, if there's a honey float going on, you just stick another super in between or you harvest it. But the supers actually kind of serve as this cloak board. They help to block her scent. So then the queen down below, her pheromones, the ones up top rearing the queen cells, they can't smell her that well. So they're more enticed. Plus they're stuffed. So it's, that's the part of the biomimicry taking place. bees will rear queens under 3 conditions, emergency, she's died, she got squished, something. Supersedure, she's starting to fail, sick, running out of semen, what have you, or swarming. And swarming is ideal, right? That's when they've got a lot of resources and they want to now reproduce on a super organismal level. And so that's what we're trying to replicate with that scenario. So I hope that kind of describes it for you. And actually, if you look at that, I put the link for that manual in the chat. It shows actually as a picture and kind of labels where those excluders go and what's in between. And then also how to align that top box, or at least our version of it.
I want to check that out for sure. Okay, next question is, how is the inbreeding in New Mexico apparent? What signs tipped you off to it happening?
Yeah, so that was right after when we brought, we took Mark's 50 and multiplied them to 100, and then we brought 50 down and left 50 up. And we used to go back and forth, but then we had one summer in Michigan where it didn't even get above 50 degrees. Believe that or not. Yeah. And so queens need to mate at 70 degrees or prefer to mate at 70. And so we kind of started to phase that out. Plus, there's a lot of sunshine. Even though we're at elevation in New Mexico, the solar gain is intense. And so that's it's really conducive, I want to say, to not only mating, but also to plant growth at elevation. And so what had happened was I think we were about 3 years into breeding here in New Mexico, and we were actually based right along the Northern Rio Grande corridor. So we were down in the valley, right along the river, and we had a really wet spring, and I saw a bunch of chalk brood, and I freaked out. Like, I was like, oh my God, we didn't have this last year. We didn't have it the year before. Like, what's going on? And so I thought, we need some chalk brood resistant stock in here. And I started doing research and saw that that's one of the indicators of potential inbreeding. And so I just took it to heart and was like, okay, I'm going to start, figuring out who I want to integrate some stock in. And we didn't just like bring in a bunch of bees. We were just really selective. I think we brought in like 2 different producers bees that year. And by saying bees, like maybe 5 queens from each of them, like not a lot, but then started to monitor them and see how they did. And then we didn't start breeding off of those until, again, everybody has to make it through at least 2 years before we actually deem them a breeding contender. And then we go back and look at the records of mite counts, any disease issues, anything like that. But those that maintain are then the ones that we deem as breeders.
Nice. Okay, next question is, what are your top 3 selection criteria for local queen propagation? I love that question. So cool.
Top 3 selection criteria?
Yeah.
Well, longevity is first and foremost. I also would say hygienic behavior. I really like to see bees that one, I don't see a lot of mites, or if I do see some mites, they are under control. One of the cool things that's kind of being looked at now, which I think is really exciting, is recapping behavior. So there are bees that are learning how to uncap brood. They just make a little kind of pinhole, right? And what it does is it changes the humidity inside the cell so that the mites that are reproducing in there die, but the larvae is fine. And then the bees go and recap it. And so there's some really cool research coming out from a number of places looking at that. So I'm hoping to really look at that more this summer. I haven't personally done it yet, but I had a researcher come out last year and she actually showed me. And so my bees are already doing it. And I was like, oh, that's cool. That's really cool. So I want to learn more about that. But hygienics, I would say gentleness is important for me. One, I have kids. 2, I first got started with very aggressive strains, so I know how serious that can be, and they are awesome. I have major respect for those aggressive strains because a lot of times they're very highly pest and disease resistant, but they can be a liability, right? Especially if you're in an urban setting or what have you. So, and I also, it's hot here in New Mexico in the summer, and I like wearing shorts and sandals. So gentleness is, I like to go out there, in my shorts and sandals. But yeah, hygienics, gentleness, and then I would also say overwintering ability, because we do have such temperature extremes. It's really, that's hard. That's hard on them, and to see those ones that can handle that is, to me, just they're just marvelous. Like I'm amazed that they can do that. So yeah, but longevity is the main one because longevity is an umbrella trait. So it kind of, all of those kind of fit underneath it, because over time you can see those traits through multiple seasons and see if it's just a fluke or if it repeats itself. And then you can go, oh, I wonder if that's part of what's giving them longevity, then that's a heritable trait.
Right. Very cool. Oh, and then this is a clarifying question. So people are asking about the, when you're talking about longevity, you're talking about both the queen longevity and the colony longevity, or just the queen longevity? So I guess maybe like, do you move the queen from one colony to another, or is she staying with the same colony? And it's the longevity of her in that same hive.
It's the longevity of her in that same hive. We don't, once they're established with their family, we don't move her at all. I mean, she just stays with her bees the whole time. The only time I'll ever move anything is sometimes I move drone brood. I'll take, and our breeders too, once they pass the 2-year threshold, we'll start to, or the 18 months, 2 winters, we will start to graft off of them. Once they start to wane, like you can tell they're getting older, or you can see the bees are starting to thinking about superseding, then I really try and get as many drones off of her as I can, drone brood. And I'll move that drone brood to mating yards so that then the last of her seeds, right? And I didn't even talk about this, but this is what blows me away. So like, between haploid and diploid, for those who aren't familiar, haploid is single genetics. So those are drones. Diploid means 2. So those are workers. They have their mom's genes and their dad's genes, whichever drone dad, right? But in terms of the drones, they are pretty much, now this isn't an accurate rendition, but this is how I like to explain it. They are clones of their mothers, right? In terms of her genetics, they only have her genetic story, except that they have, penis instead of or a phallus, I should say. They don't actually have a penis, but they have a phallus instead of female. They're not female, but basically they are the last thing that she can spit out to carry on her memories, and so they are just as important, and in fact even I'd say more so important than her daughters, because her daughters are only going to be half her. So when you have a long-lived hive, you're grafting daughters off of them, but that's only 50% of that longevity, right? And so really it's those drones that are super important. So those are the only things that'll move our drone brood out to mating yards, so that then can make sure I get some of those stock lines out there. And we're lucky. I didn't show you the whole map. I really should show a whole map of where we're at up in the mountains. We are located in a smaller community, but there's little old Spanish colonial towns throughout the mountain, about almost every 5 miles. So each one of those spots is where we have another mating apiary. And with part of this grant money now that we're getting with this new Western SARE grant, I want to really look at the DCAs and learn, are my drones from this area flying all the way over there, or are they really kind of just isolated in their own little pockets? Because drones and queens will fly farther than workers will. So I still have a lot to learn. So much more I want to figure out,
Yes, DCAs are becoming a new obsession of mine as well. So, drone congregation areas. Yeah. Okay. So next question. From your own personal experience, what are the biggest challenges bee breeders are facing presently?
Oh, I think it really depends on where you're at, for one. I'd have to say the West Coast folks are really having to deal a lot with climate change, for sure. Drought, wildfire, heavy smoke. Funny anecdotal story, or not so funny, but in its own morbid way, it's funny. I was at ABF, American Beekeeping Federation conference in January, and they had a queen panel, and they were hoping to have several producers from both the West Coast and the East Coast, and would end, I think, because of COVID, and there were a bunch of flight delays at that particular time. The only 3 folks they had up there were from the West Coast. And so I asked them, because they had people get up and ask them questions, it's a panel, so you could ask what you wanted. So I said, knowing that there's these increasing drought issues, do you all have contingency plans, or what are you thinking about? And all of them were like, it's fine, not a problem. And I was like, okay, they're in denial. Because I have a contingency plan, but at any rate, I just found it really interesting, because I think, whether they have one or not, I'm sure they're thinking about it. I'm sure they already have a plan. Like, if wildfires hit them, where do their bees go? How are they going to get them out? But as to what their long-term plans are, like, what does that mean for their selection, or for how is that going to affect their bees and the epigenetics of their bees? All of these things won't play out for a while. We don't know. So I think in the West, I think a lot of it is weather induced. I also think, where people are foraging, wherever there's big ag across the country, wherever there's big ag, especially if there's a lot of pesticide and even herbicide issues and treated seeds. There's a lot of research coming out now that's showing that these, despite these responsible applications as based on, EPA regulations, it's the long-term and the synergistic effects that we don't know anything about. And so it's that we need that longitudinal data. Like, when somebody applies a pesticide, the LD50 label will say, the bees doesn't affect bees, but they don't realize that some of these people are mixing tanks or applying one thing and then something else. And then that magnifies the toxicity of it. And so I think in big ag areas, that can be an issue. I find myself creeping farther and farther up the mountain, not because we have pesticide issues, but we do have a lot of urban beekeepers who are very well intentioned, mind you, but we don't have a lot of localized production. And even my own localized production cannot support the interest that's here. There's more demand than supply. So we have a lot of what I call bee flippers that come into the area, bringing bees from other places, really rather willy-nilly. I write a letter every year to the New Mexico Department of Ag, just trying to raise awareness about it, because it's unregulated. But it scares me, because I feel like people, I've spent over 20 years trying to select stock, and it can just take one season with people bringing in something compromised, or that's not very mite resistant, and it can just shatter 20 years worth of blood, sweat, and tears. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm really motivated to share the process, but also the history of bees and what it means and who we are as stewards, because what we do affects our neighbors, right? Whether we're new at this or we've been doing it a long time, we all affect each other. And we're all in it together. We all want healthy bees, right? But we come at it from very different perspectives and different paths, and we follow different paths. And so I think the more we can communicate, hopefully the more at least we can recognize what's within our power to manage, and what are those variables that we cannot manage. But when we can work in community and at least communicate about it, I think we give ourselves we give our bees and ourselves a much more enduring potential. And that's part of it. You have a lot of people who get into it for very good reasons, or they're well-intentioned, but then they suffer, heavy losses, or it becomes too expensive to kind of restart year after year. And who wants to have a disheartening experience like that? People don't want to lose bees. So even, in that time that they're trying to learn, if they don't stick with it, they're not really going to learn the bigger process. But also too, if we can get them started in a more mindful and, locally focused way, then it benefits everybody down the road, especially the bees.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's, for us, that's a big part of why we're doing these online workshops and the hands-on workshops that are going to be happening this summer, because you need a community of beekeepers to come into and be held by. And you also need the skills to know how to make splits from survivor stock and how to work with the longevity of your bees, so that you aren't having to have this disheartening experience, and that you can lean on that community to pull resource from if you need a frame of brood or a frame of eggs, or something that someone can support you with to make this more localized. I think it it makes the experience all the better, and it lessens the disheartening. At least I hope that's the goal.
Right. And a lot of times too, what we don't recognize is that, it's not that you can't bring bees in from other places, but it's, asking those right questions. What kind of bees are they? How were they reared? What were they fed? When were they medicated? What was their travel like? Because a lot of times too, what producers are sending you is the best that they have. And they've gone through a lot of time and effort to send you what they have. And then transportation, carriers, mail issue, trucking service, whoever it is, that can really shatter. I often use this phrase where I tell people, the best genetics can be sabotaged just by poor practices, and mediocre genetics can be exemplified by good practices. So, every bee has a chance. It's just a matter of trying to nurture it as best you can in the ways that you can.
Yeah. Well, amazing. Thank you for this. I learned some things that I want to bring into my practice, and I hope other people did as well. Just like before, we'll send a recording of the session out after. It usually takes us a few days to get it out. So probably by Friday, maybe by Monday of next week.
I'm going to read you my poem too before everybody goes.
Oh, your poem. Thank you so much. Please do. So we'll send this link out so people can access it. And I just want to announce that we're going to have the enrollment documents and the syllabus for hands-on Queen School happening here in the Northeast this summer, live on the website by the end of the month. So I will also send an email out to everyone with those details. So that's coming post haste. And I'm going to mute myself so you can read your poem, Melanie.
Cool. I don't think I've ever read a poem of mine out loud to everybody, so I'm a little shy, but it's very fitting because this presentation is what inspired me to write it yesterday in my writing group. And it's actually based on a Japanese poem form from the 7th century called tanka. And it's 5 lines, and it actually predates haikus. And so it's the first and the third lines have 5 syllables, and the second and fourth and the 5th have 7 syllables. And so here it is. So I wrote several of them, but they all build on each other. Adapt or vanish, learning to be flexible, live, love, or perish, for Mother Earth, Father Time, for mind, body, spirit, amen. Traveling through time, glimpses of all lives once lived, create memories, stories remembered again, mirroring some reflections. One seeking semblance, another finding oneself. They gathered to dream, sharing new stories while remembering the old. Passing truths between, above, below, in between, weaving mosaic for future generations to build upon them again. Forward ever now, backward never, my children. Lean in closely, please. Hear starry cosmic heartbeats of breath and blood memories. Shh.
Thank you so much, Melanie. That was really beautiful. That was such an amazing way to end.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really special that you shared that, and I appreciate the bravery of bringing it into this space. And it just highlights the tying of the arts and the sciences together. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
I think that's an awesome way to end. So I'm going to end here. Be on the lookout for emails from us about the future. And we'll see y'all soon. Thanks for coming. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.